Okay, so we are talking about electricity. There's a few different Gemaras that are relevant. I want to just look at this one Gemara. Uh, uh, I'll give it a shot here. Um, Levi bar Shmuel, Ashkechinhu, the Rabbi Abba, the Rabbi Huna. So he came to the Rabbi Abba, Rabbi Huna bar Chia, to havu kaime apitcha debe Rav Huna. They were out. They were, I guess, they were like on the porch. They were of the house of Rav Huna. Amar lahu mahu lachzir mita shel trasim b'Shabbat. What is the din about basically putting back a convertible couch? It's kind of like that. A mita trasim is like a mita that folds up, or a cot bed. It's really more correctly a cot bed that folds up and you can unfold it and put a mattress on it. Not a Murphy bed. It's like a cot bed. So can you open that on Shabbat? Amrulay Shaper Dami. He said yes. Ata the Kameh de Rav Yehuda Amar Ha Rav Shmuel de Amri Travayo Amachzir Mitat Trasim B'Shabbat Chayev Chatat. He says, what are you talking about? You're Chayev Chatat. If you make a cot bed because it was useless before, and now it's useful. Meitive Hamachzir Kane. And here's really the part that we're interested in. Meitive Machzir Kane Menorah B'Shabbat Chayev Chatat. If you basically, it's like a candelabra that the arms come off and you can slot them back in. So that's the way I understood it. Maybe somebody understood it really, but that you're chayav chata. You're building that menorah. Menorah doesn't mean like a Hanukkah menorah. It means just like a candelabra. Anyway, chayav chata. Kanei sayadin lo yachzir b'yim yachzir patur. But this thing, which is a kanei sayadin, which is essentially if you ever like had used a roller to paint your room, you can like connect an extra piece to make it longer, to make the pole longer. And you can add another piece. Maybe they had ones that were very short pieces and they could extend and contract the length of the rod when they painted the ceiling or they painted the side of the floor. If they painted the floor, they want a very short one. So they use it two different ways. Sometimes long, sometimes short. It was connected by pieces. Lo yachzir v'yimachzir patur. You shouldn't do that on Shabbat either, but if you did, it's patur aval asur. Can't do it either way. D'Rabbanan. So you see, one is D'Rabbanan, one is directed. But anyway, you see from the first case that the menorah is asur, so too the mita of turasim should be asur. Rabbi Simai Omer Keren Agula Chayav Keren Pshuta Patur. If you put together some kind of musical instrument, if it's a complicated one, that's Agula, it's got lots of parts, then you're Chayav. But if it's a simple one, then it's Patur. Inhu Damer Ki Hai Tana Ditanya Malbanot Hamita Vikiraot Hamita ולאבכים של סקיבus לא יחזיר ואם יחזיר patur. So here we have like these parts of the bed. It could be like the feet of the bed. They have like little cups on them so they don't sink into the floor, says Rashi. So if you put that together on Shabbat, patur aval asur. Patur aval asur. V'lo yitka, ve'im taka chayav. And if you really stuck it in, then you're chayav, chatat. V'shemen gamei omer, im haya rafui, if it was loose, then not only is it patur, it's actually mutar. Beirav chama have mate valinta have mehadre la biyoma tova amr lehahu midraban. Wait, I gotta remember what that means. Just a second. Anyone remember what that means? Here, I have to look at my Gemara. Mitig Right. Can you put it together? Can you put this collapsed bed together in Yom Tov? And one of the rabbis said, Amar le hahu mirabana, the Rava, my date. What do you think? Uh, maybe it's permitted because it's binyan min atzad. Binyan min atzad who means like kla'achar yad, Rashi says. Means like you're not doing it in the normal way, putting this together. And then he says nehid isur d'oraita like isur d'rabanan miya'ika. He says even though the midiraisa to put it together be forbidden, but midirabanan should be mutter. And then he says amarle ana Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel svirli imaya rafui mutter. So this is actually the idea of rafui, which is actually a halacha, interesting halacha. Like the Shmer Shabbat Shabbat says that like if your glasses come out, if the lens pops out all the time of the metal frame of your glasses, then you can put it back on Shabbos because it never really is in there in a tight way. But rafui is permitted. So here that's kind of the source for rafui. The main thing that we're interested in though is and wait, and the question is when we go back to the beginning, when we talk about the bed, are you building it rafui or not? This is all, well, we'll see. I'm going to skip the Rashi. Sorry. Okay, so here's the Hazon Ish. Somebody want to read the Hazon Ish? I typed it up nice and neat for you. Yeah, go ahead, Noah.
Okay. Sorry.
I'll help you if you get stuck.
Sounds good. Katav Harav Moshe, meaning the Rambam, Perek Tet Halacha Vav, Damatichet Damatechet, or Mechamem Ad Shetase Gachelet, Harei Ze Toledet Mevashel. So the Rambam writes in the Mishnah Torah that one who forges metal or heats it to the point where it produces a coal, that's
well, soften. I think matich is to soften it.
Okay.
It heats it up so that it gets softened, I think.
Okay, great. That's a toleda of.
Or let's say, maybe not, maybe I'm wrong. Whatever, it gets it very hot. Let's say it gets it very hot. No, that's the second one. Or it gets it to very hot. Gachelet is actually like red hot. So Harezet told that mivasha.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a kind of cooking because you softened. I think the first one. Let's say, is softened. Either you softened it or you got it red hot. That's a kind of cooking.
Right.
Think of a horseshoe.
Yeah, it's softened. The next one, Mavir, is I think gonna be to get it red hot, right?
No, he says gachelet.
Yeah, he says.
Shetase gachelet. That he says two things. Hamatich et hamatechet, you soften it, or hamechamem ad shetase gachelet, or you heat it to the point that it's red hot. Harezet told mevasha. Here, maybe I'll read it. Maybe it's easier for me. U'perak Yud Bet halacha aleph katav dehamechamem et habarzel kedei litzarfo b'mayim. If you heat up, well, notice, yeah, you heat up iron to put it into water to make it harden. Hareze told him mavir. That's mavir. So we see that there's nire da kavana b'kan. So you see that the kavana b'kan mishaneh et shorish hamalacha. That what you're intending to do changes what malacha you're doing. Because you could be heating up the metal in order to put it into water, and then it's going to be mavir. It's like lighting a fire. But if you're putting it hot in order to just get it hot or soften it or just stam, well, I don't know. In order to get it to be red hot, then that's called bishul. So it seems to be the kavanah is important. De'im metich ol se gachelet, v'rotzeh b'gachelto. And if you just want, your goal is to get red hot. Could go into rotzeh la'asot mikshe. Maybe you want to forge something. You want to make it into a certain shape, right? You don't want to put it in water. Kishahu b'kishu gachelet hurach. And when you got it red hot, it's soft. V'lerako v'lahashki'a bo tzura. Now you can urak l'rako v'lahashki'a bo tzura. It's easy to mold it now. Az melachto nikva l'todot mevashel. Then it's called bishul. Ve'ein kan mavir, and it's not fire. She'ein k'she'ein rotzei lirakek ko rak l'tzarfo. He doesn't want to. If he doesn't want to soften it, he just wants to harden it. Umal beno, by putting it in water. Bishvil l'tzarfo. He just gets it hot so that there's the way you make metal hot. Is it you make it strong is by getting it very hot and then quickly putting it in water, and then it like hardens it. It's like hardened steel. Az ein kan bishul. That's not bishul. You're not trying to make a form out of it. You're not trying to soften it. It's the part of the process of hardening it. Elamavir. So that's just fire. Ubarzel the nakit hula dugma. And the fact that he talks about barzel is just an example. For who adin shar metechot. And it's the same law by other metechot. Im shayach behen siruf. If you could do siruf bahem, any other kind of metal that could be hardened. You usually talk about hardened steel, but if there'd be hardened something else, then fine. Aval harbe min hamatechot nitachin. But many metals can be softened be'ena naase gachel, and they don't become a gachel because you can't harden them. What is he talking about? First of all, he's got a problem here. He's noticing that not only is the din different, but the words are different. The Rambam says that it's matechet here, and here he calls it barzel. Why does he change his language? So what the Hazon Ish is saying is that matechet is a more general term, and therefore many metals can be brought to this point of heating them in order to make a form. You can heat bronze or whatever, or any metal, gold, in order to make a pendant or something. You can always heat metals, and that's bishul. But when you're talking about barzel, that's something to be hardened. And then at the end he says, but of course barzel is still a dugma, because if there be some other metal that could also be hardened, then it would also be that din. But it's a subcategory of matechet. Not all matechets are hardenable, and therefore not all matechets can have a din of burning. Okay. V'data ravid sham de la'olam mechamem barzel mishum bishul v'lo mishum mavir. So the Ravid says no. Always, whenever you heat metal, is never mishum mavir. It's bishul. Okay. Is this good? Any questions? Yeah. Go ahead.
Rav Nachum, I have a question. I think now I'm understanding less the difference between Mavir and Bishul here, and I don't understand when you heat a piece of metal till it's red hot, and then you plunge it into water, which sort of like finishes it solidifies this new shape. Why is that not Bishul? Why is that Mavir?
Because you're not trying to. Because Bishul is when you take, like, let's say, Rambam actually defines bishul as taking something hard and making it soft, take something soft, making it hard. You're changing its status. And it's so like you take beans and you cook them till they're soft, or meat and you cook it. Meat actually, when you first cook it, it gets harder. But some foods you cook them, they get softer. But whenever you're trying to soften the food by heating, that's bishul. But when we're heating up metal for plunging it into water, we're not trying to soften it. That's maybe happens, but that's not our kavana, as he said. Our kavana is just to get it hot so that we can then cool it.
It's also worth noting, I think, that with a lot of the malachot, it's easier to understand them when understanding their reverse, right? And so with like kivui, right, we talk about the productive kivui is one in which you are trying to like make a functional coal. And so a lot of them describe this as mavir, largely because the thing that you're doing looks most like kivui, right? And that like the putting it out is one in which you're putting it out, turning out the heat in a way that renders something more functional or is made to like change the impact of it.
Okay, thank you. That's very interesting. All right, let me go on a little bit. This is also not the most relevant part, but v'yesh la'yin be'eno mitkaven lo l'tzaref lo l'rakech im yesh bo mishum mevashel. So he says, according to the Rambam, if you're not trying to do either of these things, you're just heating it up for some other reason. You're not trying to harden it. You're not trying to make a mold. So is bishul kind of like the default? It's hard to know what the Rambam would say. V'data Ravid da'af b'mechamem litzaref yesh po mishum v'ashel. Now the Ravid, though, it's easier to understand because he says that if you're trying to even you're just trying to harden it, it's called bishul. So then certainly if you don't so then he says bishul by everything. Le'olam asur lechamem barzel mishum bish mevashel. So for him, for the Ravid, always it would be bishul. V'nira dekol shenas yad soleded. And I believe that anything that becomes hot, that your hand would go away from, yesh bo mishum mevashel. In other words, that's the point at which bishul normally takes place of regular foods. So if the metal didn't even get red hot, but it got to the point of being the way food would be called bishul, then the metal would also be called bishul. It'd be usher, according to the Ravid, for sure, and according to the Rambam, not clear, because if you're not trying to heat it. Even though normally we say that you need to cook until you wouldn't become chayiv, even though cooking starts when it gets yad sledded, it's not actually, you're not chayiv the chatat until it gets kamacha ben drosai. Mikol makom isura ikah, but it's still usher to start cooking, called the nase yad sledded, as long as, to make it yad sledded. That's why we learned earlier that you're not allowed to put some cold water near the fire to the point where it would get to yad sledded. You could put it like a distance from the fire. But he says, right, Isura is Asur. It's certainly Asur D'Rabanan, and it could even be Asur D'Oraita. To even get it to Yad Soled, even though you didn't cook it at all. Even though you don't get a Chatat, it could be Chayiv Asur D'Oraita just to heat the metal to Yad Soled. Which is interesting because, right. Okay, so if many pots get to be Yad Soled without being red. Ve'im kvar hu miluban. What about if it was already hardened steel? It had already gone through the process of heating it and then cooling it, and now umashlichol or, and now you reheat it because you want to do libun again. And that would be mavir. Leolam yesh bo mishum bishul, according to the Rabbi. It would still be bishul. Why? That we learned even according to the poskim that say ain bishul acher bishul. So there should be chayav. He says no, but hacha ain lanu shiur. Here we don't have the shiur of macha ben drasai. In other words, when they said ain bishul acher bishul, that's because it got to the point where it was cooked to macha ben drasai, and now there's no further bishul. But they would admit that if it hadn't gotten to macha ben drasai, then there would still be bishul. It hadn't got to macha ben drasai, so it would still be bishul. But here we don't have a shear of macha ben drasai by metal. Dahatam chazi lachila, because over there in our normal cases in Shin Yud Chet, it's food. Chazi lachila, it's fit for eating. Bebishul kamacha ben drasai. Once it gets to that level, aval hacha, but by metal, ein lanu shiur ad shenase gachelet or shenitan or shenitach. We don't have a shear that it becomes red hot or that it gets soft. Yesh bo mishum bishul. We don't say that bishul starts then. In other words, there's no shear certainly of machal ben drasai because it's not relevant by metal. Nobody eats metal.
But that seems to really be the problem, right? It's not just that there's no shear. You cook up food, you're cooking so that it's, whether you eat it or not, it's edible. You brought it to an
edible state, so that's called
a piece of iron. It's hot. Period.
So it's mevushal. So that's
no. Then you'd say, well, the material difference between the two makes it that you got to kvetch it. Then you say there's no shear. There's no shear because the material itself is not meant for that kind of shear.
Well, that shear, I understand he's saying that shear
That's
is
what
a
I
shear
think. He would have been more he would have been more straightforward if he would have said something regarding that.
Well, because also part of the problem here is that the Ma'achal Ben Drosai one is useful because there is like a desired outcome that you are trying to get.
That's what I'm saying.
You are trying to arrive at an edible food. Whereas like there's one thing when you are trying to like actively, obviously they talk about like cooking a piece of like clay in the Gemara because you're actually trying to like fire it and there's a clear desired outcome. Whereas with the metal, I mean, especially with electricity, it's very difficult because in addition to the fact that most of the time you're not getting it hot enough that it's actually changing the material of the metal, like it's also not, there's not actually a material outcome you're trying to get, right? And so the whole Ma'achal Ben Drosai thing is just actually not really a relevant comparison because like when something gets hot, when electricity is being run, it's not because you're trying to, it's due to inefficiency in electricity and you don't want it to change the metal. Right. And so it's like makes it a much harder comparison because there isn't a sheer of usefulness because it wasn't useful to begin with.
Well, he's already established
the only word I would add is the word, I don't want to talk about electricity yet because he doesn't fully talk about it, is transformation. Has anything been transformed? In cooking, something gets transformed.
What he's doing is he's creating a new concept. He's creating a concept of bishul and a chiyuv of bishul where there is no transformation, where there is no...
You are exactly right. And that's a chazonish kind of idea.
He's saying there's bishul here. The Rambam says there's bishul. But then he says, take a step back. Well, bishul, we know, has a shear. And bishul shear is ma'achal ben drosai. Does the Rambam think there's ma'achal ben drosai by barzel? Obviously not, because nobody eats barzel. So therefore, there is no shear. So therefore, if the Rambam calls it bishul, then it's bishul, and the Ravid calls it bishul, then it's bishul at a certain point. What point? Must be Yad Soledetbo, because that's the only other that could be relevant to metal.
He grabs Yad Soledetbo, but in a certain sense he's saying there's no minimum, there's no minimum, therefore in a certain sense there's no maximum, but thank God for the notion of Yad Soledetbo.
Okay, let's go on.
No, I mean, I think I only being reflective on his mahalech, which the two of you have explained very well, and I have some problems with it.
Yeah, he's creating a whole system here.
He's creating,
right? He's very creative. That's why I like him, even if
that's why I don't like him.
Yeah, well, I like creativity. I'm just saying. Whether I think he's right or wrong, or whether I like his conclusions is a different question. But the creativity.
Okay, you like his creativity. Okay. Now you're suspect also. Okay.
Thank you. I like to be a suspect. But Ken lo shayech b'matechet ein bishul acher bishul. Well, that's kind of what we're all explaining. There's no the whole concept of ein bishul acher bishul does not make sense by matechet. Da mechamem et habarzel. Ein nefkuta bein im nitchamem kvar bezman min hazmanim imlo. Because when you heat it up, doesn't matter. Like you heat up a pot to the Yad Soledetbo, and then it gets cool again, and then you heat it up again. Like, it's not like, oh, this pot has been heated to Yad Soledet, so it's different. You don't recognize that difference where you do by food. If you cook food, then it's cooked food now. It's very different. Cooked rice is very different from raw rice. It's not like ochel. The rice it's clear that the rice has been cooked after you cooked it. It's nikarbo. It's obvious in the rice that it has gone through a process of cooking. So it makes sense that there is no bishul acher bishul because it's been softened, and you can't soften it again. And that's why the poskim say there is bishul acher bishul by liquids, or particularly by water. And even according to the Rambam, who holds ein bishul acher bishul, who holds the belach ein bishul acher bishul, that by liquids there is no bishul acher bishul also.
So you can cook the broth again.
Because why? B'matechet modim the svirale lahani poskim demayim evushalim Gam ken chalukin mimayim chayim. In other words, the reason that the poskim say that there is no bishul acher bishul, that's because they believe that cooked water is somehow different from not cooked water. We discussed this actually when we learned bishul. In other words, you can maybe tell the difference. It maybe tastes different. The water that has gone through a process of bishul is different. So therefore, it is nikar. It is clear that the water has gone through bishul, so there's no bishul acher bishul. Aval hacha b'matechet, but by metal, he shava l'tivo rishon legamri. It goes back to its original state entirely. And there's no nikarness. So therefore, there's no concept of ein bishul acher bishul. Therefore, every time you heat the metal, it's a new event. And it has nothing to do with the previous events. And you can't tell me that I cooked it already, so I'm not going to be chayiv.
But it never, I shouldn't really get argued, but it never was transformed to begin with. All it did was get hot.
Right. Like I agree that it makes sense to say ein bishul achar bishul with metal. I just think that the argument of calling it bishul in the first place.
No, yesh bishul acher bishul with metal.
Sorry. Yes. I think it makes sense to say if you were going to say bishul that there's yesh bishul achar bishul in this case because it hasn't meaningfully been transformed. I just think that the whole concept is that bishul is about transformation and there's no meaningful transformation occurring. And so
but the Rambam says, guys, the Rambam says, and the Ravid agrees, everybody agrees, there's bishul by metal. That's not a question.
Yeah.
But the Rambam also limits it. Like he's really I think he arguably is expanding the Rambam's application to something that is very different than what the Rambam is talking about.
Wait, but did it?
Well, it's true. The Rambam didn't say yad soledet. The Rambam just said if you get it to be soft or red hot. He never seemed to say about yad soledet. But he's saying, he's saying he thinks it's a fear of yad soledet because that's the fear of bishul.
Just a clarification question. Didn't this paragraph begin by saying that according to the Rambam, we're actually not sure if the peula in and of itself without the kavanah would constitute bishul? And then this entire time we've actually been functioning. We
in
said
the Ravid.
In the Rambam, we said we're not sure.
Right. No, I'm saying he's been functioning in the Rambam, in the Ravid. And everything he said now makes sense according to the Ravid.
Right.
You're saying according to the Rambam, who we're not sure. Yeah, okay. So he's not
that's
sure.
How we left it. Right.
100%. We're all in. We're in a suffix world of we don't know. Is the way he says it. We're not sure what the Rambam would say about when kavana is not involved. But that's only because he said that kavana is a relevant factor here. Whether it's mavir or bishul. In other words, what he said is if you're trying to do one thing, it's bishul, and trying to do another thing, it's mavir. And the Hazon Ish says, well, what if you're not trying to do either? Which one is it, or is it none of them? That was his question, and he doesn't know. Maybe it is bishul. It's not clear. The Ravid for sure is bishul. Always. That's what he said. And so you're right. It's only for sure this is a question for the Ravid. In the Rambam, we're not sure. But he does say there's bishul by metechet, so that's for sure.
Who says that it's a suffix in the Rambam?
The Hazon Ish.
Yeah, well, I don't think anybody else does. I mean, as Lexi said, it's Rambam. He seems to define it pretty well. I think he defines it pretty well.
Okay, but still, the Ravid, I don't know. Anyway, my point is like this: he made a chiluk. He made his own chiluk. He's like a brisker. He made his own chiluk between what you're trying to do this or that. It changed when you're trying to do one or the other thing. It changes the malacha of heating the metal. The same malacha can change from the same action of heating the metal can change from mavir to bishul. And he made a chiluk of why. It has to do with your kavana. And then he says, well, once I made this chiluk, I painted myself into a corner. Now I don't know what would be the din when you don't have either of those things. But so if you don't accept his chiluk, then you maybe don't have a problem. And if you don't accept his chiluk, then maybe for sure bishul is always a problem. He was the one who created the whole problem of saying it only if you're trying to soften the metal is it called bishul. You could say in pashtus, anytime you heat metal, it's bishul. Anyway, I agree. He created a certain chiluk in din, and he left it as a doubt.
So how does it work, just out of curiosity, if you have a metal pot that you're keeping your food warm in, right? You can never, I guess in the Gemara, they were only talking about clay pots, but if you have now metal pots that are your catering.
According to it sound, I mean, I don't know if this is really what he means, but you could, so far, the way I'm explaining it, whether I'm right or wrong, I don't know. The way I'm explaining it is it could come out that you couldn't take a pot and put it on a plata on Shabbat, even if it was an empty pot, if you thought the pot would get to be Yad Salepipo. Which is a bit of a chumrah, a very big chumrah.
That's like a Hazon chumrah. I don't even think the Hazon said it.
I don't even think he said it. I think it sort of flows from what he's saying here. At least the way.
You got a good point. You have a very good point.
And that's a kasha on him. Maybe it's a kasha on him because we know.
I think a big kasha.
Yeah, it's a big kasha. All right, but let's just go on. Let's go on in what he's saying before we try to discredit him. I don't want to discredit him. I mean, my job is to defend him here. Okay. Umena amur, and from everything that we've said, nilmad la madlik ner chashmal b'Shabbat yesh bo mishum mechamem et habarzel. There's a piece of tungsten metal there, which in a filament, in a regular filament light, or even in a plata that you plug in a plata on Shabbat, there's a filament there that gets red hot. Mechamem et habarzel sheyesh bo mishum mivashim. So that's for sure. If you turn on an electric light, an old-fashioned, a regular electric light, not the modern ones, ela dehave sikresha de lo nichale mikol makol maser. But of course, it's a sikresha de lo nichale because you don't want the metal to get hot. That's not. It doesn't. You don't care. Lo nichale. You don't benefit from that. You just benefit from the light. I don't know, but it's a sikresha. In other words, it's for sure going to happen when you heat up. When you get the light, you're going to also heat up.
It's not only low nich, like it's not only that you don't care. Like again, it's actively bad. Like in many
actively
ways.
Bad because well, he's about to say that it's actively good. You're saying it's bad because it's like waste. It wastes electricity.
Yeah.
You'd rather a system that lit it up without any heat, and then you wouldn't waste anything in heating. But here, listen what he says: the efshar lahachimum sorechbo. He says maybe the chimum is actually useful. Lahavarat hazer machashmal nichale. And Josie can tell me if I'm correct here, but I think that if you heat up a metal, it becomes a better conductor. Is that right?
No,
in other words,
worse.
It's worse. It's a worse conductor.
Okay.
So I was just going to say superconductors, they always want to be cold.
Right. It becomes.
So lahabarat, I don't know. So he says it maybe is useful for lahabarat hazer chashib nichale. I don't know why that would be nichale. Okay. Mihu. Of course, this is only if some portion of the metal or of the chut, the wire, got to be actually Yad Salet. Of course, it does. It gets to be like, I don't know, 1,000 degrees or something. It gets very hot.
It gets to be so hot that some of us had easy bake ovens as children, which were powered by a 100-watt light bulb, and you could bake things under the light of a 100-watt light bulb. Yeah, I can see people laughing at this, but no, it really is a thing.
I didn't have one, but my neighbor did, and we made cake.
You can make little cakes and things. Yeah.
So, the Indian mavir im miktzat min hachut naase gachelet efshar diyesh bo mishum mavir ledat harambam. So he says regarding mavir, where we said that mavir is when you want to harden it, you want to put it in water, which is mavir, is not bishul. We're talking about mavir now, fire. The end mavir is if it's fire, if it does become red hot, he says efshar, because remember why he says efshar? This is your point, Noam, that it's only efshar because he doesn't really know if you're not trying to put it in water afterward, then maybe it's not clear. Mihu, but if you wouldn't get the metal red hot, or nitazin minachut, even if sparks of light flowed from the wire, one after the other, bitmidut, in a constant flow, ein ze mavir. It wouldn't become mavir just because you saw light coming from it. I don't know. I mean, a light emitting diode, it's not hot, but there is some kind of light coming from it. Yesh bo mishum shvut. Then there'd be an isser anyway, and what the shvut is, ein motzi'in or min ha'avanim v'kiyotzi b'zeh. There's an isser d'Rabbanan of making or light from stones on Shabbat. So he's saying the Isser Rabbanan of making light from stones, which we didn't really come across in our studies, but it would apply to even a case, Isser Rabbanan of making light of any sort, maybe even an LED.
In fact, that's exactly how an LED works, is it doesn't heat the stone, but it is you're sending electricity through effectively a stone. Okay.
Like
and
a
you
crystal, like what is it, a quartz crystal or something?
Not necessarily a quartz crystal, although you have quartz to focus the lights. But it's basically just a solid state material, and you run electricity through it and emits photons, and then you have a lens to focus it, right? But that's exactly it. A computer is just a bunch of fancy rocks that we send lightning through and convince ourselves that it's thinking.
Okay, well, let's not get into too philosophical here, but yeah. But I agree with you. So he seems to be saying that even an LED, because it makes light, would be in the category of an Isser Rabbanan for this concept of
Is he saying it's molid? Because I know that argument comes from others.
No, he's not saying it's molid. That molid would be an Isser Deraisa, probably.
No, molid's an Isser Rabbanan.
And in fact,
but that's not the Isser that he's talking about. He's saying it's a specific thing called motzi or me'avanim.
Wait, but Rav Nachum, there's the Mishnah in Beitza says ein motzina or min avanim, and then the Gemara in Beitza asks what's the Isser, and the answer is molid.
Oh, okay. So there you go. So
I actually think it is what he's referring to.
Okay, good. Thank you. I did not know that Mishnah. Vod yesh bezeh mishum tikun mana. And he says also there's a problem of tikkun mana, which is literally fixing a thing, fixing some object. Kevan shemamid al tichunato lizrom et hazer machashmal b'tmidut, because you establish the item according to its properties. Now, there's according to its proper way of behaving, that electricity should flow through it in a constant flow. In other words, it's useless. A light that is not turned on is very useless. When it's turned on, then it's in its tichunato. It's in its proper features. So therefore, it's mitaken manet. The karov hadavar de zebone minatora, and it's close. But he's not saying it is, but it's close to building from the Torah law. K'osei, just like one who would make a kli. Because we discussed this also a lot, but it comes out that basically making a kli is usher according to the Torah. If you would make a violin, it would be usher, even if the gluing might be forbidden and all kinds of parts of the process. But also when you finally finished it, it would be usher because of makabeh patish. The kol shekain kan shekol achutim mechubarim labayit. Well, when you plug in your light, it's connected to the house. So then it's binyan in something that is mechubar to the ground. It's connected to the ground. The ein kan mishum ein binyan bekeli. So you can't tell me there's no binyan bekeli because it's connected to the ground, and therefore it's not a kli. It's part of your house. When you plug in your, especially you plug in your grounded, computer with 3 plugs. It's you're connecting it to the ground. Literally.
But you're not building that. You're connecting it. And most that's like mitaken mana is like also making something useful, right? Which is a rabbinic prohibition. I think very clearly plugging something in or like putting a battery in is mitaken mana, because you're taking something that was a not useful object and making it a useful object. But even that is considered different. That's considered a rabbinic prohibition as opposed to like the biblical one of like makabeh patish, where you're finishing the creation of something. I think plugging something into the electric.
He's going to get into this. He's going to get into this. He's going to try to say that it is makabeh patish, or it is making it useful. The ein kan mishum ein binyan bekelim, right? We said because it's connected to the ground. Eladino ki mechubar diyesh bo mishum binyan v'stira. It's like mechubar that has building and destruction. Aval hacha ein nifkuta bezeh, but here it doesn't make a difference. Da'afilu b'kelim ki hai gavna, because even if we would say it's a kli and it's not connected to the ground, chashi bone, it would still be called bone because of makabeh patish, which he didn't say yet, but he's going to say. I think he's going to say. And now, I don't know, is this interesting? I think this is very interesting. This is like, everybody hears this Hazon Ish, that the Hazon Ish says this, but, it's interesting to see it improving. So he's giving a few different issues. Vehine, Amru b'Shabbos Mem Zayin. That's what we saw. That was the Gemara that we learned at the beginning. The Kaneshel Sayadin, that this painter's brush, Lo Yachzir, V'im Echzir Patur Aval Asur. If you did it, it's forbidden. V'Lechora Tani Kaneshel Sayadin Dumya de Menorah. Duration. And Lechora, it's similar to the menorah. Like, what's the difference? The menorah is also parts that you put together. The Iri bitaka, that we're talking about where you put it together. Vafilu hachi bekane sayadin patur. But for some reason, by the painter's brush, it's patur. What is it? The time of the menorah ikir tashmisha b'murkevet. Upiruk eino bishvil tashmish el sibacheret. The way you use a candelabra is when it's all built together, when the pieces are there. And taking it apart is for some other reason. Maybe you want to clean it. Aval kaneh shel sayadin. But the kaneh shel sayadin yesh lo shnei tashmishim. It has two uses. Dibemakom namuch. If you're painting near the floor, ein ra'ui kaneh aroch. You don't want a long pole. Ubemakom gavoa ein ra'ui kaneh katzar. You don't want a short one when you're painting the ceiling. Hilcha kishemaricho lefisha. Therefore, when you lengthen it for some short time, af shetakao chashiv ke he'emid kli al gabe kli. Even though you stuck it together, it's still considered like two separate klis. They still have their separate identities. Kli al gabe kli kidei lahagia lemakom gavoa. And you just did it to get to the makom gavoa. Velo nachit alei shem kaneh aroch. It's not called a kaneh aroch because it has two functions. It's sometimes a kaneh aroch and sometimes a kaneh katzar. And you just made it aroch for this purpose, which is unlike the menorah, which, when it's disassembled, is useless. You only want it to be useful. And when you disassemble it, it's for some other reason. Aval midivrei Rambam va'aritva nira de orcha de milta nakit de katani menorah tokan v'kanei sayadin kevan de tzarich leforko tamid eno toko b'chozek. Since, in other words, according to the Ramban and the Ritva, when it says that you toko, you pushed it in hard, that was just the way that people normally do it. Since you're good, and since if you're a painter, you don't push it in really hard, because in a few hours you're going to take it apart. You don't want to make your life difficult. So you don't put it in so hard. Aval kol shetako chayav chatat. But any case where you would put it in, you would be chayav chatat. V'ken muchach meha de mita de trasin, dafal gav de omedet leforka. That even though by that bed that you built, this for the one night that you're sleeping as you're traveling, mekom makom im taka hayav chatat. We saw that if you did it not, remember the final conclusion of the Gemara was that if you did it strong, then you'd be chayav. If you did it weak, then you could be patur. That's why the first opinion in the Gemara says that it's mutter to make this bed, because he was assuming you did it weakly. You did it rofef. You did it not really stuck in. Wait, what I didn't really explain the Rambam and the Ramban and the Ritva. What was his point there? Let me look at that again. He says, again, I got to read that again. I go back to the middle of that paragraph. Hilchach. You see in the middle of the fourth line. I'm just reading again. The hilchach kishamaricho lefisha. When you lengthen it for some time, af shetakao chashiv ke'amid kli al gabe kli. Even if you stuck it in really hard, That's what he's saying. Even if you you're a painter and you stuck it in really hard, it would be still considered a kli on the top of a kli. It wouldn't make it into one kli. It doesn't, no matter how hard you put it together, it would still retain its two named items. It would still be two separate items that you put together temporarily, and it wouldn't become one item. Unlike the menorah, the candelabra that you connect together, it's now a candelabra. It becomes one thing. And then he says, "Aval midivrei Rambam v'Ritva nira de orcha de milton nakit de katan de kane de menorah tokein v'kane sayedin kevan de sarich leforko tamid eino tokein b'chozek." He's saying the fact that he didn't, in other words, you might think that the reason why, he's trying to prevent you from thinking that the reason why by the painters it's permitted, or it's patur, you might think it's because he didn't do it b'chozek. And the reason why it's usher in the menorah is because he did it b'chozek. And he says, no, it's just orcha de milta. It's just like it's a normal way, but that's not the key factor. The key factor is whether it's got two purposes or not. Whether it's useful in both its states. Since the painter's thing is useful in both states, now think about electricity. Is a fan useful in its on and off state? Or is it only useful in its on state? So it's more, in other words, a fan, if you turn it off, it's useless. So it's more like the menorah, which is when you mefarek it, it's useless. Whereas it's not like the handle that you make it shorter or longer, both are useful. Rabbi Landis. You're muted.
Not to be.
There.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
So is this, but this only makes sense for plugging in. It doesn't make sense that if it's already plugged in, pushing the button.
No, why? It's useless. A fan that's turned off is a useless item.
It's not. It's an item just like a toilet is like not
Right.
working when it's sitting there. And
No,
then
you can
push the
you can sit on a toilet when it. What do you mean?
Okay, I could sit on the toilet and not do the thing that the toilet, the plumbing system is used for. I could also use like my electric handheld.
Yeah, you could also use the menorah
to like carry something on it if I wanted.
Yeah, you could use the candelabra to crack nuts. But the point is, when you put it together, it becomes a candelabra.
Yeah, when you put it together, it becomes a candelabra. It needs to be put together. If I'm holding my handheld vacuum cleaner, it's a handheld vacuum cleaner that's already a fully functional one, and I press it for it to run. Just like, again, I flush my toilet.
I don't know if that's true. It's not function. It's not useful. I would say totally wrong. I will tell you proof. If you have a fan that's plugged in and running, let me finish my sentence. If you had a fan that was plugged in and running, and it had a long wire, you could move on Shabbos. You're allowed to move it around to fan different people in the room. But if it is turned off, it's muksa. So you see that it's a useless item when it's off, and it's a useful item when it's on.
That's a circular argument, because the reason it's considered to be muktzah when it's off is based off of arguments like the Hazon Ishus that says that it's useless when it's off.
But the svara is
entirely circular.
No, it's not circular, because any item, there's a basic principle that underlies it, which is that any item that is useless is muktzah.
But we're saying it's useless because we're saying that
everybody agrees that a fan that's off is useless. I mean, you could crack nuts with it, but it's useless.
Because again, if you switched the knob on it, it already actually has everything that it needs to function. You're turning I
understand. I know what fans work. But
I'm saying that turning something on and off is very different than creating something, like running something the way it was meant to run.
Listen, ultimately, everything is different from everything. But we're trying to see the comparison. Everything is different from everything. The question is there a comparison?
Putting a battery in feels like a much better comparison because without a battery, I can't do
Okay.
I can't do anything with it. Once the battery is in, I'm pressing a button to make a thing that's already like fully functional do the function that
I hear your distinction, but he's going a step further. That's all I'm saying. He's saying that even we didn't see it yet. I just said that, but we'll see. I think we're going to see it. No.
I just want to say, I read a fantastic article in Lehrhouse online, which I'm happy to share with everyone, that actually argued exactly like what Rav Landy said. Well, sorry, he didn't say exactly this, but similar to what Rav Landy said, that there's actually a kula in the Hazon Ish for that reason. He's talking about turning things on and off. He's not talking about manipulating things. And the article argued that people have misunderstood the Hazon Ish.
Okay, maybe that's true. Well, I think he's talking about turning things on and off.
Who was that brilliant guy?
It's Rabbi Dan Margulies. Okay. I don't know him personally, but I'll put the article in the chat.
Send it to us. Yeah.
All right, you send it by email. It's probably better. But anyway, let's go on. Uvetichat hachashmal shemachnis hazerem bachut. Vetichat hachashmal is turning a switch on that causes the zerem to go. Shemachnisim hazerem bachutim. But when I read this, I thought we're putting the zerem in the people in Yemen, in the Houthim, which is probably a good idea also. But upetichat hachashmal, I mean, at least the ones who want to kill us. Upetichat hachashmal shemachnisim hazerem bachutim chashiv leolam kitokea. That is considered like a mamish pushing it in with koach. If you turn on the switch, that's not rofef. That's not light. That's a serious connection. Da'af im tim saloimer dekane shel sayadin af pitaka eino ella midrabanan. That even if you want to say that by the painter's pole, even when you put it together strongly, it would still only be the Rabbanan. Hainu davka b'harkava shel shnei geshamim. That's talking about connecting two separate things. She'efshar lechashben kishnayim mishtatfim bepula achat. It's like two things coming to create one, or causing one action. In other words, two tools that are putting together to paint the ceiling, I guess. Ein hatka'a michra'atan legeshem echad. The fact that you stick them together doesn't cause it to become one thing. There's still two separate poles. Kol shepirukan nachutz latiach shel namuch. I'll separate them whenever I want to paint down low. Aval tikun surah lageshem v'naseh al yedei zeh shimush. But creating something into one thing, and then geshem means one thing, and then v'naseh al yedei zeh shimush, and then I can do the whatever productive thing I wanted to do. V'adai chashiv bonen. In other words, extending a pole is not bone because there's still two poles separate. But when I turn the switch on, I made one thing that now does the pula that I want, and therefore that's bone. Va'af im hashimush hu l'shaot miyuchadot, and even if the shimush is for a short period, va'achar kach posko, and then you're going to turn it off again. Dehapsika hu mikan ulahaba, that now it's going to be off. V'hatzura harishona eino bat pirud min hageshem. But the first, it's a little bit weak, this language here. He says the first form cannot be removed from the item. In other words, the working form cannot be removed from the item. Now you can jump in and say, well, so if it's not removed, then you didn't put it there in the first place. Because shekain im gam bekaneh shel sayadim chayav kishitoka'ah. And if you're going to say that no, the sayadim is chayav actually, when it said it was patur, it was only because you did it in a loose way, like Rashi said, like some people said. But if you did it in a firm way, then it would be chayav even by the poles. Dahacha chayav. Wait. Ve'im gam bekane shel sayadim chayav kishetaka dahaka chayav af agav de psiko la'achar shak. Here also you'd be chayav if you're over there chayav in the poles, even though you take it apart later. V'acharesha hadlaka hu binyan hakibui hu no, and and once we said that building it, that turning it on is building, then turning it off would be soter, and would also be aser. So he's basically saying the point that we're basically getting here is that he's saying like this, that the putting two things together and just using them together, like you have, let's say, I don't know, two poles that you can twist, you can screw them together, and now you have a longer pole. Well, that's not binyan, because it's meant to be unscrewed and screwed, and you can use it long and you can use it short. Like if you have, let's say, walking poles that you can you can screw in an extra piece to make it longer, or you can make it shorter. I mean, walking poles are not built that way nowadays, but like if there would be such a thing as a walking pole that was short, and then you can screw in on the bottom and make it a little longer, then that would be just two items that you put together, and they're each two items. But unlike that is the case of electricity, where when you turn it on, it's not two items, it's one item. The connection is one item.
Well, right, but isn't it Auerbach who says it's really more like opening and closing a door, right? That as opposed to like building something that's meant to stay.
Yeah.
It's like you're opening and closing a circuit
Yeah, but why is it different from opening? So now go the other way. Why is it different from opening and closing a door?
I mean, like you could say that there's something about when you close it, a functionality it adds that closing a door doesn't add to a room, but it does, right? Closing a door makes a room into a closed off room, which it was not beforehand.
No, but a room is very useful even with the door open. I don't close the door to certain rooms in my house ever.
Right, but bonnet, like the whole point is that it's supposed to be a thing that is like finishing. If something is not finishing the thing, but it is designed to be constantly flipping back and forth, to call it makeh b'patish, like all of the examples that we get of makeh b'patish are irreversible, right? Like all of the ones that Rashi and Tosfot, all of those examples are actions that are done once, as opposed to a thing that is meant to be constantly cycled through.
Yeah, but he's talking about this case. Why is it that putting the menorah together, when it comes apart, aser and chayv chatat? That's also can be taken apart and put together. It's all the time you take it apart and put it together, and yet that's chayv chatat. That's his starting point. So,
but it's also not about part of his. I think part of the distinction. I think part of what Auerbach mentions is that, like in the menorah, you've taken something, you have fully assembled a new thing or deconstructed it. Here, it is literally a closing and an opening, right? It is not that you are putting together the entirety of a menorah. It is that something is being closed or something is being opened, which again, structurally, he says is much more comparable to a door than to reassembling an entire kli.
Yeah, let's see what he says about a pot. And
let's see what he says about a pot. Isn't the case here that's more analogous, maybe the case of the shutters that we see in Beitza, where there's a question about removing shutters on Shabbat and whether or not that's bonnet, and
if they're attached, but there it's different also because
right, maybe an intermediate case between the door and other things be worth thinking about.
The shutters, the din of the shutters is that if they're connected by a chain, then you could do it, and if they're not connected by a chain, then you couldn't do it, as far as I recall.
My memory that so Beit Shammai say that you can't put them on Yom Tov, and Beit Hillel say you can, but maybe it's only because of Simchat Yom Tov. And then Abaye says it's only problematic if there's a middle hinge or chain or something. So, yeah.
But there's people saying that that's forbidden, and I don't know. That's
exactly.
Also...
But so Abaye is saying it's only forbidden if it has a middle chain, and other people are saying it's more forbidden.
Right, even though it's meant to be put together and put off. Right? Exactly. But let's see here. He's going to talk about a pot. It's very interesting. V'hadit katvu ataz v'magen Avram siman shin yud gimel demuter litkoa et kisui akli. You could like really stick in firmly the lid for a pot. Kevan she'omed lisgor b'liftach, because you actually are meant to sometimes open it and sometimes take it apart. So you see that kind of like your door case. It's meant to be put together and put apart. So why is that different from the menorah? The menorah is also meant to be taken apart when you want to clean it. Hainu davka bekisui she'ein stimat she'ein stimat. Hainu davka bekisui. That's dafka by a lid. She'ein stimat hakli binyan, because covering a kli is not binyan, elishimush to kli. That's elishimush. Sorry, elishimush. It's just normal use. Putting the lid on. Well, what's his proof? The kli satum leolam eino kli. A kli that's covered ceases to be a useful kli because you can't put things in it. You have to take the cover off. The kol inyan hakli hu liot patuach v'lishamesh bo. Just like a door of a house. If it's locked, it's useless. You want to be able to go into the house. You have to open it. And when you cover it, when you don't want to anymore put things into it, therefore the lid and the pot are not one thing. They're two items. They use them together, like the kaneh of the painter. Aval harkava hadrusha l'shimush kumo kaneh sayadim. But building something that is that aval harkava hadrusha l'shimush kumo kaneh sayadim. But putting something together, like in order to use it, like the kaneh of sayadim, or a mita shel trisim, or they were putting that together, putting the bed together in order to use it. Vizer machashmal, and putting electricity through an item. Af tikun lishach hashibone. Even a fixing temporarily is considered bonet, because all of these things turn the item, allow you to use the item, and becomes one thing. But the pot is like two things that you can, or the door, or maybe the halon that you pakaket the halon, the trees in the halon, maybe it's also like two things. V'ken hamitlamed, and so too, a person who's learning hashchazat sakin, a person who's learning how to sharpen a knife for shchita, shehemid et hasakin lishchot bo, that he created the shchita knife for using it. Afagav de bedato gomo, even though he wants to later ruin it because he wants to practice sharpening. Tekavachar shchita mekom makom chashiv bonet. The binyan l'shach chashiv bonet, because even if it's temporary, it's considered bonet. Then he brings the Chai Adam. I guess I'll skip that, but he brings the Chai Adam who talks about winding a clock, a watch on Shabbat, and he says that it's chayav chata. Because, and he sort of learns, he's basically saying that actually maybe we should look at this. The katav v'chai adam dehaorech et hasha'on, that if you wind up a clock or watch, chayav chatat mishum tikun mana. Why? You're chayav chatat because you fixed something, because it was useless before. V'yalif la mehada amrina be'eruvin, and he learns it from the Gemara in Eruvin. The meshal shel milamata v'korech milamali, talking about there about like a violin string that came off, and you have Levi'im in the Beis HaMikdash who want to play on Shabbos and they need the violins. So if yesh bo mishum chiyuv chatas, if the string breaks and you pull and you unravel the string a little bit and connect it again on the other end, you're chayav chatat. V'hinei hatam b'kricha the winding chashiv bone, the winding of the string around the peg of the violin and reattaching it is bone. Mishum sheminichol olam, because you're doing it forever. You want to, that's the way you use it. Even if it would be lightly connected, but it's considered still but here, by winding a watch on Shabbos, et hasha'on asui lit parek, it's going to unwound. V'gam ein kan chibur prakim klal, and there's no parts that are being added. And when you wind a watch, you're not adding any part. Elahacha al yedei arichato, but by winding it, yotzer koach hadash, you create a new force. Beha misovev, when you in the spring, sheyidchok ala ofanaim, that will push the gears, sheyanu kulam, that they'll start turning. V'hamadato al tchuna zo, here he uses the same word tchuna, and putting it in its rightful functioning order, hu bonen, o makabapatish. It's bonen or makabapatish. So he's basically saying, if you don't believe me, believe the Chai Adam. He's saying that this is even a much lesser case, because you're not even turning you're just winding it, and nothing actually became attached that wasn't attached. When you turn the electricity, you're attaching something. His basic point, if we can summarize his basic point is that when any time that you create something that's useful from something that works in its functioning proper way, when it previously wasn't in its functioning proper way, then that's called either bone or makabapatish. And therefore, turning on an electric item will be makabapatish or bone.
I think the Chai Adam is brilliant, what he says, without a doubt. I don't see the connection. I don't see connections, too much of a pun word. I don't mean it here, but I don't see the connection. Well, maybe say it that way. The Chai Adam talks about a connection, a real connection. But what's going on
what are
here
you doing when you're winding a watch?
What's going on here is not a real connection.
Connection is what are you doing when you're winding a watch? You're doing nothing. You're just turning, it's all there. You didn't add any new pieces, you just wound the crown. And yet it's usher because you've created a working thing from a non-working thing. And that's what electricity does. That's what turning the switch does.
Well, but also when you're winding a watch, again, the part of it is like that you're fixing the thing. Like when you are having to rewind a watch, it's that it actually was not already continuously functioning in the way that it was meant to, even though all of the physical pieces are there. As in, it is not that it is just like, it is functioning in the way it was meant to. It is that like actually it needed to be changed to function in the way that it needs to, as opposed to, oh, turning this thing on and off is the normal way of its functioning. That a watch that is not set correctly is considered to be not functioning, is considered to be meaningfully broken in a sense, whereas a device that is fully functional that is not currently turned on is not related to as broken.
I hear what you're saying. You're saying that a watch that's not wound is more broken than an electric item that's not turned on, because everyone expects you to turn it off sometimes, whereas nobody expects you to turn off a watch sometimes.
Right. The watch is not meant to be going to the wrong time or stop functioning, whereas it is part of the normal usage of.
Well, no, he's not talking about a watch that's just not. You're allowed to move the hands of a watch. He's not talking about moving the hands.
Yeah, he's talking about
winding.
Yeah.
No, you're allowed to set it. If a
Yeah.
watch is ticking, you're allowed to set it. He's talking about winding it.
Exactly. So it is not meant, the watch is not meant to stop clicking. Like it is in fact meant to continue doing that. It is not
Right, exactly. No, that's what I said. I understand your distinction. He doesn't agree with that distinction. He thinks that it's a question of whether the item is performing its tehuna. Is it performing its tehuna or not? And he says the tehuna of an electric vacuum cleaner is to vacuum and not to sit in the corner. Just like a watch, its tehuna is to run. And the fact that it's running all the time is irrelevant.
But like, is my knife when it's like hanging on, like when it's in my knife block and not being used to chop things, not a knife?
Well, actually, according to Aristotle, yes, it's not a knife. It has to be doing its action, whatever. But that's a philosophical question. Yeah, I mean, it's still right. It is still a knife. Obviously, halakhically, it's a knife, uh, but it's capable of doing its function. A off vacuum cleaner is not capable of doing its function. Anyway, let's take a break here and we'll see some other tshuvas quickly. I'll just continue. I think I'm going to continue reading because it's, even though I make mistakes, I'll do it faster. Here, look, this is the Shoot Bear Moshe, which is Moshe Stern, who was a Rav from Europe who came, I'm not sure exactly when, to America. He was born like in 1905 and died in like early 80s or something. He lived in New York, but he studied in Europe. I just found him. I never heard of him really, but I found him because Jessica mentioned the Aruch HaShulchan, and I couldn't find the Aruch HaShulchan is not in the Aruch HaShulchan's book itself, where he mentions electricity. It's in a kind of like a journal, some rabbinic journal. Here it's mentioned here. Beit Vad. Here it says Beit Vad HaChachamim. That's the journal. Ayin Beit Vad HaChachamim Shvat Taf Reish Samech Gimel. I think this is 1903. Shuvat Me'agon Bal Aruch HaShulchan. And listen to what he, so now this Moshe Stern is very upset that he's saying all these people, all these rabbis, these great rabbis who talked about this electricity way back in the day, they didn't understand what they were talking about. They didn't understand, they hadn't a degree in electricity, and they didn't even understand it, and they really were wrong. And you can't base anything on what they said because they didn't understand what was going on. That's basically what he says. V'hine et hagaon bala aruch hashulchan. I couldn't find this journal itself, so I'm sorry. V'hine et hagaon bala aruch hashulchan hashgacha pratit shamra militaot lahalacha lemaisa. The divine guidance prevented him from making an actual mistake. Didato gamke nata lahatir hadlakat air electric that his mind or his thoughts led him to think that maybe he was inclined, let's say he was inclined to permit electric lights, hadlakat ner electric, b'yom tov, dafkan yom tov, because it's just like continuing electrical power. Shegam hu zechet tzaddik livracha ta'ah b'havanat ma'aseh ha'or electric. He also was mistaken in his understanding of the electrical signals. Aval katav, but he wrote, and here's the only quote I could find. Jess, if you find it more, if the whole tshuva, send it to me. Sheken haya nirelo lahat. I don't understand how this could be shekatav, and then it's a quote. Maybe I added those quotes. I don't know. Ad kan l'shono. This seems to be a quote. Shekatav sheken haya nirelo lahatir lefi havanato b'melechet elektri ki eno mitzuya berube ha'arim shalano. It's not. Maybe this is where the quote starts. Ki eno merube berube ha'arim shalano. It's not commonly found in our shtetls. In he was in Europe in 1903. It was not. Not everybody has this electricity. La'amod b'diyuk al totzotav, to understand exactly what it is. He's basically saying he doesn't. It almost sounds like he's saying he never saw electricity, but he heard about it, and he can't really answer because he never saw it. And then he's ad kan l'sham. Then he says, "Harei shamar rucho lifsoch halacha lemaaseh." So his spirit prevented him from actually paskening, ki havanato lo haya lo brura, because he knew that he didn't fully understand it. Havanato shekatav shuhu shkaga muchletet ve'ein hadat. So anyway, whatever. He just says that the Aruch HaShulchan sort of thought to matter it, but he didn't actually matter it. And anyway, he admitted that he didn't really ever see it. So that's the only thing I found. Now, he could just be making that up. I don't know if Moshe Stern really knows. I didn't read, and I didn't find the actual tshuva. Now I want to go to Igros Moshe. And
I just want to say Moshe Stern in his day was a big guy. Let's say he was a big fish.
yeah, I was waiting for you to tell me who he was. Yeah.
He was a big fish. And how do you know that? Anyway, because his Piskei Halacha were talked about everywhere, Anyway, that's all I can tell you about.
I suspected such a thing. But I didn't want to say anything because I don't really know who he is. But he was a European Rav who was in New York, anyway, which is where all important people were at that time. So here's Igros Moshe. This is from 1969. Shabbat. Notice what it says. Menachem Av Yud Yom Shabbat. I don't know what that means. Yud Dalid. How could it be b'Shabbat v'Yom Tov? I'm sorry.
Microphone.
I'm skipping. I should never skip. Tam ha'isser. So the question is Tam ha'isser. The questioner was asking is why is it usser? Tam ha'isser the daber microphone b'Shabbat v'Yom Tov. Now he's talking about microphone, which is not turning on a switch necessarily. But Yom Tov, and now he's giving the date. Yud Dalid Menachem Av, 1969. Me'et Kvodo Yedidi Mereinu Harav Yitzchak Sidleski Shlita. The Devar Ledaver b'Shabbat al Yidei microphone. Pashut Shasur. Can't use a microphone on Shabbat. V'kvar Pirsamu Agudat Rabbanim Shehu Asur. The rabbis have said it's Asur. V'av she'ke inshe shelo yadu lahem hatamim hamechuyavim lishmoa lehorot hachachamim. And even though some people didn't know the reason that it's forbidden, they still have to listen to the decree of the rabbis. And those that were lenient to this microphone were not doing proper. Even if they say about themselves that they're gadolim b'Torah, they're wrong. You can't go against what the rabbi said, what this aguda said, this union, this group. And then he goes on, and he says, "Ve'ever b'kitzur etamim shehem shnayim sheyesh behen chashash isur d'oraita u'shnayim shehem isur d'rabanan vadaim midrabanan." So he says there are two reasons that it could be usur, perhaps minatorah, and two reasons that it's for sure usur d'rabanan. Here, he goes like this. So he's going to go. The yesh yadash shekol hanishma me'amicrophone eino kol ha'adam atzmo. When you hear the sound, it's not the sound of the person. Ela kishemidaber nase roshem shel havarotav sham. When a person speaks, his voice makes an impression into the microphone. Uma shenishma hu kol havara, and what you hear. Sorry, I lost my thought here. Eino kol ha'adam atzmo ela kishemidaber nase roshem shel havaratav sham uma shenishma hu kol havara. You only hear the reproduce. I think he's saying you only hear the reproduced sound, but there's a roshem made into the microphone. The zehu chashash isur d'oraita. This could be isur d'oraita b'mashe diburo naase roshem be'eze makom b'microphone, because your speech is making some impression. If you the way a microphone works, it's actually like a little speaker. It's a cloth. It's like a filament suspended, and when you talk, it vibrates the filament, which then creates an electric signal. So you're making a roshem, he's saying, on that filament. It's very temporary roshem. Immediately goes away. Va'af she'ein ze ketiva, even though it's not ketiva, she'eino otio. Yesh al kol panim eze chashash melechet me'acher she'nitchadesh eze davar she'al yedei ze nishma kol. Even though it's not really writing because there's no letters, but it's still a worry that there's maybe a malacha here because something was created, and that by means of that created thing, you hear a kol ram, you hear a loud sound. Umirachok ulai makeb kol ram umirachok. I don't know. Ulai makeb patish ulai bone. And then that could be maybe not writing, but maybe it's pat makeb patish, maybe bone. But tzarich la'ayen b'birur eze melacha. We'd have to really think about what melacha would be. Al kol panim tam zehu lachush le'isur deraita. According to this reason, you should worry that maybe it's isur deraita af shelo barura isur, even though it's not clear what the isur is. It's a funny kind of concept that he's saying we're not sure which isur it is, but it probably it's a chashash. Not saying it for sure is. These are two chashashot. And what's the second chashash? Shelefi midat kol nigdal hotzat koach elektri. V'nimsa shebediburo hu magdil maktin et elektri. Right, there's more electric power being when you talk louder. It causes the signal to increase or decrease. If you're quieter. V'roim zeh b'chush k'shemeshabrim od mechona b'chashmal hamodedet hadibur b'hamicrophone l'mi sherotzeh lahashvot et hakol. He says, you can know this because you can connect as an equalizer to the microphone and see the signals going up and down. In other words, you can measure the electrical signals changing as you're talking. So even if you don't put this equalizer on there, this signal detector, yodim anachnu she משתמש בדיבורו באלקטרי יותר ממה שהמיקרופון בחיבורו משתמש בעצמו בלא דיבור. We know that more signal is going through when nobody is than when nobody is talking. When you are talking, more signal is going through. וכשמדבר בקול רם, and when you shout, משתמש בעוד יותר, you use even more electricity. והמשתמשות B'kochot electricity, yesh chashas is d'oraita, and the using of the power of electricity is a potential d'oraita problem. Af below havara, even if it's not fire. V'yesh layen b'zetuva the ma'aseh. So again, he's not giving a clear what the isser is, but he's saying you're using more and less. It's not just static. There's some dynamic behavior here. Again, he's not saying what isser is.
So it sounds like, but he's not. Does Rav Moshe have a position on the electricity question? Like, it doesn't sound like he's siding with the Hazon Ish here.
Oh, he's not siding with the Hazon Ish. No, I don't think so. Well, he did say makeh b'patish or bona. He did say, but didn't he say?
Apparently a thing about Moshe Tendler saying that Rav Moshe had agreed with Rav Auerbach vis-a-vis the bona point, but I would have to double check that citation.
Here he says that when there was a move in America between some Orthodox rabbis whose shuls were built the way the big conservative shuls were built, the I don't know what you call them, whatever it is, the Protestant seating kind of thing, and therefore needed a microphone. So there's a whole question of whether remembering the term solid state microphone, because a solid state microphone didn't allow for the electricity to vary. And at least in one case I know of, in Stamford, Connecticut, the shul there got a heter, specific heter. They sent all the designs from the Rav, and the synagogue that I daven, one of the synagogues I daven is a young person. My great grandfather supposedly gave a heter, and that's the same kind of case, because the electrical variation. But this whole thing about variations is really the true same sound. Of course, has other hashlachot. For example, are you really hearing the Megillah if it's through a microphone? Are you really hearing the shofar if it's through the microphone? So I'm saying is, these things have other parts.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I'm not.
I guess what I meant to say before, though, when I'm saying solid state, but the saying is that if there's a technological problem, maybe the bigger issue, sometimes there's a technological solution. And what do you do with that?
Right. Well, he's about to say other problems, but these are two. Yeah, I'm not sure I buy it that there is a possibility of a microphone that wouldn't change its electrical. I mean, the electrical signal has to change. That's how the speaker will then reproduce the call. Maybe, I mean, and then the quantity of electricity wasn't changed. It's possible the quantity of electricity doesn't change somehow. I don't know much about electricity.
I can't down on it. I'm just giving testimony. I'm only giving testimony.
I don't think the thing that's being measured is the quantity of electricity when you see those fluctuations. Like I would have.
It's watts. It's watts. I think it is. You have speakers that can handle a certain amount of watts, and as the music gets louder, it's using the capacity of the speaker can or cannot handle those watts.
Well, there's also a difference.
Anyway, I don't know much about it.
Capacities and things being used when it's a speaker for music versus also microphones used for human voice. Also, the things.
Right. Well, the range of human voice is less. Yeah. Anyway, I'm just saying what he's saying. He's saying that it is changing the electrical signal, and I suppose he spoke to some person before saying that. Anyway, Kevan. Now here's the two D'Rabbanan ones. Kevan de Bechol. Here he's going to get now to much more difficult to avoid problems, I think. Kevan, can you turn off the water, please? Kevan de Bechol, since during the week, Derek lechaber microphone electric, rak b'shah shetzrichim ledaber bo v'lo kodem. Normally, you just you turn on the electric microphone when you want to use it. ולכן אף אם לא היה שום איסור בעצם הדיבור אסור זה מדרבנן. So even if using a microphone that was left on from before Shabbat wouldn't be asur in any way, it would still be asur d'Rabbanan. Why? Mehasha asur litain chitim letoch rechayim. It's forbidden to put wheat into a mill, shelmayim, a water mill, be'erev Shabbat. You're not before Shabbat, but you can't put them in and let the water just run and grind your stones. Ela kedei sheyitachnu b'Shabbat kediti b'Shabbos daf yudchet. And the Gemara in Shabbos says you can't do that, even if you just want it to grind on Shabbat, but you're not going to do anything on Shabbat. Umefurish b'Beit Yosef sof siman shin lamed chet divra matchil katav ha'igur. שמטעם זה היה לנו למאסר להכין ולערוך זוג המקשקש לשעות. And that's why it's for this reason, he says like this, the Shulchan Aruch, the Beit Yosef says, it should be forbidden to wind a watch before Shabbat. Zug mikashkashim means a watch, or a grandfather clock, really. La'arokh zug l'sha'ot, hasuya al yedei mishkalot, that has those, those pine cones, those heavy pine cones that you pull up and down. It would be forbidden to set up to wind your grandfather clock before Shabbat, really. Shehem hazigers. That means sha'on. Hagdolim, the big grandfather clock. Shayu b'dorot kodmim, that people used to have. Ubiyaldutenu, and when we were children, ishtamashtu od v'harbe batim bezigers ke'edu. We used to use these kind of cuckoo clocks or whatever they were. Aval kevan sha'af b'mei hachol regilim. He says like this. So why can you bechol zot wind the watch before Shabbat? Because kevan sha'af b'mei hachol regilim l'takno. Because normally, even on a Wednesday, you wind the clock. Yom shalem. In other words, l'takno, you wind it up so that it'll work all Wednesday. Wednesday morning, you wind it, so it should work until Thursday morning. So therefore, mutter gam erev Shabbat. So why should Friday be any different, or even erev Shabbat? She'ein ligzor shema yomru. There's no reason to make a gezerah that maybe you'll say b'Shabbat herichoto. People might come to think, oh, you wound it on Shabbat. We're not going to make that gezerah. Kevan shebekol yom mechinim miyom sha'avar, because it's just a normal thing. Everybody knows that you wind up a watch once a day. And so if they see it on Shabbat, they'll assume you wound it up before Shabbat. Why would they assume we were winding it every hour? Only neurotic people wind their watch every hour. Normal people wind it once a day. So there's no reason to go there. Hare mefurash. So now what's the Rav Moshe going to learn from this? He's going to now learn the other way around. Hare mefurash. She'im ein osim ken b'chol. That if it wouldn't be for the fact that we wind watches once a day, then it would be usher to wind it. Then it would be usher to even wind it before Shabbat, even though you're going to not do anything on Shabbat, because people would say you wound it on Shabbat. That is, if people would wind their watches every hour, then you couldn't wind the watch right before Shabbat and even not touch it, because people would think maybe you wound it on Shabbat. But again, kevan to be a me'achol mechabrim et microphone rakish tzarich ledaber. Since on a normal circumstance, people turn on the microphone when they want to use it. So therefore, people will assume you did the same thing in shul. Also, the chabar b'erev Shabbat. Therefore, it's forbidden to put it before Shabbat. I'll call a Shabbat, even though you can leave it on all Shabbat. Kadesh yidabru bo b'Shabbat shaharei efshar lomar shahayom kodem hadrasha v'kodem hatfila chibru le'elekter. Because people might say that hayom, that today in the morning of Shabbat, kodem hadrasha, in other words, early in the morning, they turned it on. Umitam zeh asur lahamid be'erev Shabbat radio, and this is, by the way, big. People always say, oh, there's no issue. You can just leave a television on all Shabbat and watch it. He says no. Therefore, it's asur lahamid be'erev Shabbat's radio b'televizia. You can't have a radio or a television left on before Shabbat. They wrote to the Shabbat Shabbat. Why? Because people will say normal people don't leave the TV on all 24 hours a day. So they'll say you must have turned it on. So he's learning. He's not inventing a gezerah. Don't say he's inventing a gezerah. The Beit Yosef discusses this, and it has to do with chitin. It's from the Gemara. You can't put wheat in a water mill before Shabbat because people will think you did it on Shabbat. So the din of a Gemara that you can't do things that look like you might have done it on Shabbat. So therefore, you can't even leave the microphone on before Shabbat, says Rav Moshe. And that's the issue of Rabbanah, if you don't say there's any others. And then he says, the fourth reason and final reason, it's also using a musical instrument. That we don't use musical instruments because you might tune them, or because almost everybody in the world knows how to fix a microphone. In other words, if the microphone's not working, you fiddle with it and it starts working. While you're talking. Sometimes the microphone goes off while the speaker is speaking, they know how to go up and fix it. This happens all the time. This is for sure an isur Rabbanan. And it won't help if you put the microphone in a box so that you can't touch any of the things on it. Because if once it's asur Rabbanan, it's asur in every way. Even if you put af kishaose atzmo shelo yitakno, even though you make it so it's impossible to fix it. Even though you can't actually fix this microphone, since microphones are generally fixable, this gezerah is going to always apply. But the chen barur microphone asur l'shtamesh bo b'Shabbat v'Yom Tov ve'en lahakel af litzorech gadol. You can't even allow it for a great need. V'lechen asur l'ma'alat kvodo. Therefore, it's forbidden for you, my friend, likabel misra, to work kazo, to work in the synagogue. Sheyitztarech ledaber the microphone to Shabbat Yom Tov. If the synagogue wants you to have a microphone and on Shabbat and Yom Tov, so he's telling this guy you can't take the job. What do you got?
I got that what Max sent us And what no one mentioned, but I think Jessica sent us, the Max especially, that Somet, excuse me, what's the name of that Kiruv organization? What did he send me from?
They were quoting Aish, but the Zomet.
Yeah, Aish. No, it was the Aish. Okay, Aish. So Aish Torah brings the Somet heter of a certain what I said before, a technological solution to all the technological problems and of that. And they quote all the Gedolim. So the interesting sociological fact, all the Gedolim that normally they don't quote or rely upon. Rav Yisrael Yisraeli Gaon and Gadol, Rav Unterman Gaon and Gadol, to find the solution of how you could have a microphone and responding to the problems Rav Moshe talks about. It's very interesting. In other words, it's a,
well, I wonder if it is responding. I wonder if in other words, I wonder what Rav Moshe would say about a grumma microphone.
Okay, so we have to take a look. I mean, the good thing, give a plug for learning, is that if you just read the Somet, not the Somet, if you just read the, what's the name of that group again? I think I blotted that group out of my mind. What's it called again?
I tried to. It's called Aish.
Aish. Okay. Well, if anything was Osir and Shabbos is Aish, but any of them. But without the learning that you provided for us today, and in general, you could read one of those things and understand what the hell they're really talking about and where they're right or where they may be wrong. So there's a number of sociological factors here. And it turns out then that Aish, which represents the right wing, needs to have a situation where people can hear them. And therefore they have to go to the Tzomet. The Tzomet microphone was originally made for battleships and things like that, or people in tanks. It was a whole thing like that, for that they could hear things on Shabbos, and then it became a general thing potentially be used. Even though I really don't know of any shuls in Israel that use it, the Eish Torah will take it.
I mean, the thing is like this: in order to allow the microphone, you'd have to say that normally during the week we use the grumma switch. It kind of would have to say something like that, because he's saying, as long as you're doing an abnormal behavior, then it's kind of forbidden. It has to be that what you're doing is what everybody always does, and therefore, if everybody uses a grumma switch all the time, I think it would be more. Then Rav Moshe wouldn't have much to say, maybe. Because it wouldn't be like
the technology also got better in terms of what he says about microphones. I understand that. I went to a dinner honoring, because in San Diego, the founder of Qualcomm. Qualcomm is like one of the biggest, and the microphone, it was all set in by Qualcomm engineers, and the microphone broke down. So you figure out there's always a technological problem also, but technology has gotten better.
All right, so let's just here is Rav. I think it's Rav Orbach, right? This is the next tshuva. I'm not gonna be able to read any of this, but Shlomo Zalman Orbach, yeah, Minchat Shlomo. So I think this is the main tshuva that you should all. Anybody who wants to really be involved with this should really read these things. Here's just a line. Haya nira lechora lefi zeh she'ein shum isur la'aroch sha'on b'Shabbat v'yom tov gam b'shah shehu omed legamri. He says, according to what he said previously, it comes out that you should really be able to wind a clock, even if it's turned off entirely. Kevan sheken tashmishot tamid, because that's what you do. You wind a watch when it's off. Shemipam lepam hu mafsik, because it sometimes stops. Hilucho, it stops going. Umarichim oto מחדש, ונמצא שאין לחשוב כלל את העריכה כתיקון מנה או מכה בפטיש. So he says the exact opposite of what Rav Hazon Ish said. והאמת הוא, דמשום סברה זו, Tir hapanim meiros la'aroch sha'on b'Shabbat gam b'shah shehu omed. All right, I'm not going to go on anymore. I don't have time, but just pointing out that you're beginning to see pikpukim, doubts about the conclusions that we've seen up to now. What else do I have here? Then he says, I'll call pani muchach shapir meprimegadim desover she'ein chiluk klal bein im chashadhu al etzem kol hatchina o shemachmat kol hasha'on yitu lachshov shegam arach oto b'Shabbat. Right, there's this whole issue of like making a sound, and people will think that you're running you started it on Shabbat. I'm going to skip this. Sorry, I didn't really. Here, page up. When I get to some other things. No. I went the wrong way. Okay. Okay, it's Tzitz Eliezer. Again, I'm not doing this any credit. Like, I'm not giving you anywhere near what you really should have, but we saw like the Chumrah opinions. But the Chen Mikol Halin, from everything we said above, Nira, De'en Lahatir Hafalat Mechona Charshim. He's talking about Skirat B'Yom Shabbat Gufa. He says, it seems to me you can't turn on a hearing aid on Shabbat. In other words, talking about using it is different, but turning on the hearing aid, he says you shouldn't do. Imutar lecharshim l'se'et b'Shabbat mechonat charshim misug kazo asher asolela shelahen po'elet me'ev v'chamishim sha'a. What can you wear a hearing aid that has a battery that works 150 hours? Ba'ofen she'en tzarich la'asot behem shum davar b'Shabbat rak litaltel et ha'mechona b'kis she'b'malbush. You just put it in your pocket. These are old-fashioned hearing aids that the battery was in your pocket and they got a wire or something. This is like from the early 70s or something. Efshar lahatir lehem et hatiltul afal pi shehu muksa. He says even you can carry it even though it's muksa. Ki bilti ha-mechona hazot ein l'chereshim yicholim l'shtatef b'tefillah. They can't daven. They can't hear. Or create a Torah. They can't hear the Torah. Again, mipnei she'efshar lachshiv Perish midaber ve'eno shomeh kechole she'en bo sakana lahatir lo tiltu davar muksa. Maybe we should let him move muksa because he's like a chole. Va'od zot deyesh makom lachshiv ki yesh beze ktzat sakanat nefashot. Debeli hamechona eno shomeh shum kol. It might be dangerous. You don't hear anything without it. V'rash b'shuk. You won't hear a car maybe. Ubekal yavoli de sakana al yedei kli mirakev. I think kli mirakev means a car. Umitzad sheni ein lachush la'acherim she'amechona shelahen tzarich lechadesh asol gam b'Shabbat sheyiru v'yechaku et maseu. And what about people who's like have short batteries? They have to change them all the time. Maybe they'll also start to do that. Lo yadu achiluk bein mechona shelahem bein. They won't know the difference between their machine and his. That's just the question, I guess. Ulam le'etzem ha'sheila nir lefi hanazi sheyesh makom lahatir lecheresh l'seit mechonat chereshim b'Shabbat kishelo tzrichim la'asot bo shum pu'ula shel ha'pu'ulot ha'sololot mitanot. So first of all, he says you can even carry it in your pocket, but it's also that's really a separate topic. But really, obviously, you can listen to it. That was just, okay. Wait a second. We're just jumping around here. Still tool. Why am I? Here he says, Tishani hatam gabe sha'on. Mechusar maase al hamshacha. It's mechusar maase means it needs something to be done to it. Al hamshacha for its continuation. We can hafsaka lo bakiim la'achar zman b'gemar melucha b'gemar hamilui. In other words, when the winding runs out, then it will finish. He says the main way you want to watch is that it should be nimsa tamid b'matzav shel halicha. You want it to always be going. Sheyachol laharot et hasha'ah, that it can show the time. Upula hamilui hu she chutar al kach sheyeh b'matzav shel halicha. I don't know that word chutar. Tear. I guess it helps it to be going all the time. Masha ein came b'nidonenu שמשקפי השמעה, משקפי השמעה. These are glasses that are hearing glasses. They're עומדים מוכנים ותשמיש. Okay, he's talking about the cherish. You know, they used to have glasses that had like a microphone in them. Yeah, this is, I guess I didn't have it. Here's Mishpatei Uziel. This is Rav Uziel, who was the chief Sephardi rabbi of Israel. What does he say? Shana taf reish pei chet. What year is that? Gotta be a long time ago.
27 or something like that?
Yeah,
Yeah,
28. Yeah, like 27. Bioti ba'artzot abrit. I was in America. Nifgashti im sha'ava nafshi harav hagaon harav hagadol hagaon hamufrasam baki b'chedrei Torah b'vitzina dinahora. I don't know what that means. Yehuda Yudel Rosenberg.
What Sinid Nohara has to do with like a bright light, basically.
Uh-huh. Rav Avbetin Laguda Kahal Anshe Sfard. How could he be Rosenberg? Anyway, and he was
There's
Sfard, I guess
more things about him, but he was a very creative.
He was a Chassid. I think Anshe Sfard is usually the Chassidim. Be'ir Montreal. Medina, Canada. Kebdani בקונטרסו החשוב מאור החשמל, שבו דלה מים מבורות עמוקים והעלה להלכה להתיר הבהרת וכיבוי מאור החשמל ביום טוב. ועד כאן לא, he allowed you to turn on a light on Yom Tov. ועד כאן לא אסתיע לי מילתא. I didn't have the time to read it. Vata ad karatan milta la'ayen b'sheila zu. Now I do have time to discuss it. Zu b'kol prateha v'levarer b'ezrat Hashem asim mivtachi ki yinacheni b'derech hayeshara lekaven lamita shel Torah. Okay, so he says, hopefully I'll get the right psak. But now I think I chose something here where he says a final answer. I'm just sort of looking for the final. We can't really do the logic of this because it's billions of pages. Right, Rav Moshe and the Hazon Ish were relatively short. I see here. So here he says, "V'al kol panim nira vadai she'ein le'esor hadlakat hachashmal mitam zeh sheharei hadlakat hachashmal eino molid or ela moshech zerem hara sheneachezet b'chutim hadakim shebetoch ha'ashashit." He says you should be allowed to continue the fire because you're not really lighting Eno molid or, you're not creating light, but you're just causing the light. He's called the zerem of the ha'ara, of the light. Sheneachezet bechutim, the stream of light in the wire, they're already there, and you're just letting them continue. It's just like letting an existing fire continue on its way. Shehi nimtzeit ve'omedet. Kodem shemitgaleh v'hasarat ha'matzor. There's just a dam holding it back, and when you pull away the dam, you let the light flow. So you're not lighting a new light. We're talking about a Yom Tov. We're talking about lighting a Yom Tov. O mitziut koach hamoshech hadlakat ba, v'lechen ein la b'hadlakat ma'or hashmal lo mishum molid v'lo mishum nolad. It's not molid or nolad. Umuter l'savev hamafteach. You can turn the switch. O lidchok b'kaftor, or to press a button. כדי לפתוח זרם החשמל שיחדור לתוך החוטים שבעששית. I don't know what is an ashashit. I used to know that word. ותאיר אותם. The chutim that are in the, I guess like the
Ashashit is a type of lamp.
I guess so. Or the bait, I think it's the bait menorah, the thing that holds the light bulb. Anyway, so here he's saying this is a pretty clear source for this idea of lighting on Shabbat. Now, this is the same Rav, we didn't read it before, but the same Rav who discussed that the Aruch HaShulchan was wrong because he didn't understand how electricity worked. He also said the same thing about Rav Uziel, who we're just reading here. In other words, he also felt that this is not a correct understanding of how electricity works. But I just thought I was excited when I found the actual statement that I had heard as a rumor that people did this. And I have something.
It was more than a rumor. There were
people that did this. No, I knew.
There were great Rosh Yeshiva who did it, but then they did it on Yom Tov, for Yom Tov, yeah.
On Yom Tov.
On Yom Tov. It had to be L'tzorach Yom Tov. The light wasn't on in the sukkah. You could turn on the light in the sukkah.
Uh-huh.
I mean, it had to be L'tzorach Yom Tov. They figured it was exactly what's said here. The electricity is stored right there. They were actually going on the idea that it's Eish. It's not that
They're just letting the fire continue.
But the electricity is kind of actually it's a transfer. They didn't say it on Shabbos, and that was a tradition in my family, L'tzorach, which we said came back from my great-grandfather. And that was true with Rabbi Ruderman until his later years when he had to really guard it, but many of his Talmidim. And it was true of the Rav in the early days.
Right, I heard it the name of the Rav.
Yeah, in the name of the Rav. Well, that the Rav did it. And the Rav said, right, it's a transfer of fire into your opening and closing. So that's in terms of Yom Tov. And just to be straight with Talmidim, I don't think electricity on Shabbos is more than a drabanan. I don't think it's less than a drabanan. And there's issues of tzorach gadol, and you have to be serious about tzorach gadol. Can't be a TV show I can't miss or something, but there's such a thing as tzorach gadol. Many times I've been matir with the shinui and all the rest. and to confess Bisman is that I can't take the elevator because I fall.
Can take the
staircase. What?
Staircase.
Staircase, I'm sorry, I can't take the staircase because I fall. I use the elevator on Shabbos through a shinui. I just have to tell you, and
right. Well,
I used to climb
I wanted to mention that actually.
Many stories down. But
I wanted to mention that actually because we discussed about the Ramban last week. We discussed about refuah on Shabbat with a shinui in the Ramban. Where did he get this idea from? And then I was looking into it further, and basically, yeah, anytime there's a tzorech gadol, you can do it, Rabbanan, with a shinui. That's basically the conclusion, and that's the Ramban is just saying the same thing. He's saying we talked about last week, if you're sick and you have only a Jew there, no goy, so that's a tzorech gadol, so you can do it, Rabbanan, with a shinui. Anyway, I want to see just this last line in yellow here, which is the conclusion of Rav Uziel. Me'ata b'nidon didan hadavar barur. It's obvious to the call to everyone. Sha'or hu davar shahaguf kolo nehne mimenu. Your whole body enjoys this light that you're getting when you turn on the light. V'yesh bo mishum simchat yom tov, and therefore turning on a light is always simchat yom tov. V'dino ka'ochel nefesh, and therefore it's considered like ochel nefesh, atzmo, shemuter lasoto, b'yom tov. And therefore, don't tell me that the fire is not related to food. The fire, and the only food the fire is allowed. No, it is related to food. It's like ochel nefesh. V'kvar ketavnu she'ein b'hadlaka zo lo mishum molid v'lo mishum nolad, v'lechen nir la'nias daiti la'halacha la'atir Adlakat Ma'or Chashmal B'Yom Tov. Amazing. I find that amazing. But like I said, this first rabbi that we saw, Rav Moshe Stern, thinks he's wrong. And I think as a public policy, we don't really want to create a situation where people are treating electricity as something that's usable, because you're going to end up doing almost everything that you do. Like my wife actually has a friend who's not religious who says that he would almost consider keeping Shabbat just so that he would have one day where his family wouldn't be on their phones. Once we allow electricity, so then why not just the phone? It's nothing. It's just it's such a small amount of electricity.
Well, I mean, obviously, yeah, there's like the classic discussion that a lot of people seem to have, which a lot of the intrinsic wariness that I feel like a lot of the post-game have around it is that there are so many forbidden, like clearly forbidden things that you can do with electricity, that it's also very easy, like if you don't just say electricity is forbidden, for people to do things that are like clearly for other reasons very forbidden. And so like that's also for those who want to be more permissive, try and figure out how to draw boundaries around things that like unambiguously are a forbidden thing to do with electricity, regardless of your view on electricity itself.
Right. But that's also true. Now, there's two issues. One issue is you may come to do something that's really forbidden with electricity. And secondly, what I was saying is that you're creating a spirit, you're creating a mood of Shabbos, which is different from the rest of the week. And one of those major differences today is electricity. Muksa is kind of this. There's actually discussion that the muksa is the same thing. That there are people who are batel the whole week. So how is Shabbat different for them? They don't work anyway. They just sit around. So by creating muksa, we created a way for their Shabbos to be different from their weekday.
So the argument for the spirituality of the law, as opposed to the letter of the law, works in a very interesting way. I also want to, of course, put my gushpanka, my seal of approval on the idea that yes, public policy, but then as a posek, you have to decide if you think it's drabanan and it's a truly tzarech gadol. But then you give them things like a certain shinui to do, so that they know it's not just just for review, it's not just a hefker belt. It's not just anything goes.
In other words, you're saying you should, if you want, you have to get a heter from a Rav. You can't just matter for yourself all electricity. Okay, shkoyach.
Yishkach you.
Shkoyach, I hope this encourages you to want to read more. We didn't really read Rav Auerbach. It's a fascinating topic. I showed you what I think are the opinions. All right, next week I think is Lexi. More to come.
Yeah,
She'll
we're gonna
tell you.